Today I'm out in an old growth forest, and old growth forests have been basically eliminated for most of southern Ontario as it's been converted to agriculture. There's very few spots left that have not had their forests cleared, and so they're in second and third and fourth cuts, and there's not a lot of this left. It's very rare, and some of the trees in here are over 280 years old. So this area has been preserved in its original condition, and the biodiversity of this area is much higher than in other areas. Here you can see a tree and the size of the trees, and when this tree falls down in the forest, it's providing food for the fungus, food for woodpeckers, and food for all sorts of different organisms. Some woodpeckers and different creatures need these larger trees so that they make cavities in them and they can reproduce, and they need these larger trees to reproduce successfully. And over time, these are obviously going to break down, the fungus are going to colonize it, and that becomes our organic matter. And here, this tree has fallen down, so it's created what's called a gap, so an opening in the forest. Normally the forest is completely closed in, and there's not a lot of openings for other species, younger trees, to colonize. So when a big tree like this falls down, you can see around me there's a lot of different small trees that have popped up, and they rapidly grow in these different areas and they fill them back in. So understanding this kind of dynamic that happens in an old growth forest is really important. So you have this mixture of deadwood, and you have this mixture of rapid regrowth. And normally in this old growth forest, you have a lot of trees and not a lot of light makes it down to the ground. So you have a good covering of things like spring ephemerals that come up really fast in the spring before the canopy closes, and then they die off. And so it's much more open underneath an old growth forest, and it has a lot more organic matter. And if this tree had fallen down and it had tipped up its roots, you would have what's called a pit and a mound, and I'll show you that a little bit later. So this old growth forest is considered beech maple forest, and sadly at this point in time a lot of these beech trees are dying off because there's an introduced disease that's killing off a lot of these huge beech trees. And here you can see the fungus growing out of the beech tree, and it's really a tragedy losing these species. We've lost a lot of species that are from our climax forests. We've lost the American chestnut, we've lost the elm trees, we've lost elm, and now we've lost ash, and this is the beech tree that we're losing now. So it's really tragic to be losing all these major species from the ecosystem because of introduced species. And there really needs to be more control on the movement of invasive species and different species between continents, because it's really hard once you get an organism into your ecosystem they just move through like a huge wave, and it's basically unstoppable. And places like conservation areas are having a really hard time figuring out, okay, what do we plant in these ecosystems when we're doing ecological restoration, because we've lost so many of the major species. The ecosystems that we're creating are now much different than what were originally there, and not having certain components of the ecosystem, major components of the ecosystem, makes it very hard to choose what species should be going in, because you don't have that base anymore, and we're putting in other species to try to compensate for the ecosystem functions that we've lost. In this area you can see there's a lot of large trees, and when that happens the canopy closes completely and it limits the amount of light reaching the forest floor. And one of the characteristics, this is a huge maple tree, an Acer species, and one of the characteristics that we're missing from these forests that are regrowing is all these different epiphytes, these mosses, these lichens that are growing on trees, and that whole component is missing from a restored forest, from a secondary growth forest. After you've cut it down, most of these species disappear. So it's an important component to think about when you're restoring an ecosystem. And around here you can see there's a good mix of not only really large trees, but a mixture of different age classes. So you don't have a tree planting where you're having all the species coming up and they're all exactly the same age, and then of course they're all going to die around the same age. So you don't have that mixed age class in a newer forest. So it's something you need to consider when you're doing an ecological restoration project. Do you go in and thin the forest and allow some other trees to germinate? Do you go in and plant at different times, or putting in different species so that you have more of a mosaic of different canopy heights and different species coming in and coming out through the ecosystem? And when you're doing restoration project, you need to think about these gaps in the forest and how they're re-establishing themselves, because it's part of the successional process. Some forests, when they're doing a conservation treatment to it, they'll actually go in and cut down trees and create some gaps so that you're actually allowing some of this mosaic to come in of different age structures. So when you're doing an ecological restoration project, you need to think about all these different aspects. You need to think about not only the big trees, the climax trees, but you need to think about all the primary successional trees, and how do you get to this climax forest, because it's essential that we need these climax forests, these old growth forests, to occur more frequently in our landscape, because there's a lot of species that need and depend on older forests. So this ground cover is mostly what's called jewelweed, an impatient species, and it's an excellent species for different things like hummingbirds, and it also has a very unique dispersal mechanism, which if I can find one down here. So here's the jewelweed, and it's an excellent species for creatures like hummingbirds, and it has a really unique dispersal mechanism. And you can see here we have the seed pod, and then if you touch it, it explodes, and so it's sending its seed out. And most of the ground cover in this forest is this jewelweed. Another dispersal mechanism is having these little it's kind of hooks on the ends of these seed, and they stick onto your jacket, or they stick onto an animal that's moving through the forest. And so these seeds are getting dispersed in different ways, and so you need to consider that as well. The maple tree has got keys, and so when it's released high in the canopy, it floats down and it spreads out into different areas of the forest, or else birds eat the seed, move them to other areas. Squirrels take oak seed and different things like that, and they move them around, bury them, forget about them, and leave them in the forest. So considering all these different dispersal mechanisms for the different species that you've got in a forest is really important to understand the interactions, and sometimes you can even recruit the wild animals to eat seed and move them for you. And that's what we did with the wildlife ponds in the Yucatan, is attracting the birds to our area so that they would disperse our seeds.